Hi, I'm Jared Fuller. Welcome to Scratching the Surface. Sometimes I think that what this show is trying to do at the end of the day is find new ways to talk about this word design. How we work, what we do, how we think about what we do. Design, as you surely know, is this incredibly expansive word that can contain all sorts of ideas and professions and practices and outputs. I'm trying to catalog those here. I'm trying to pull the curtain back on how designers working today describe what they do, regardless of the content. I'm trying to figure out what it means to be a designer today. And perhaps at the risk of hyperbole, I'm trying to help redefine what we mean when we talk about design. I immediately felt like I had found a kindred spirit in this task when I opened designer and cultural historian Maggie Gram's new book, The Invention of Design, A 20th Century History. In this book, Maggie, I think, is asking the same questions, but is looking back in time. This is not a book of design styles or even a book of design history, really. It's not a book of trends or aesthetics or of famous designers. Instead, this is an intellectual history of design. It's a history of how design has been talked about, written about, defined, and redefined. In other words, this felt like a book that was written just for me. Charting major shifts in design from beauty to problem solving to thinking, Maggie maps how design has been defined and in many ways legitimized by the people who practice it. In each chapter, she focuses on a handful of designers who helped expand design's scope and in the process helped redefine our conception of it. But alongside this history, the book also has a political project. In expanding design scope, Maggie also charts design's relationship to power and how that increased power attributed to designers has been used both for good and for ill. So in this episode, I'm excited to be joined by Maggie Gram to talk about the book and to talk about design and to talk about what we talk about when we talk about design. We talk about our understanding of design and about design's larger political project. Maggie is also a designer at Google, so we talk about that too. How did writing this book change how she thought about her own work as a designer? And how did her current work perhaps color her understanding of how design has been practiced throughout history? In many ways, this is a quintessential Scratching the Surface episode. It asks the big questions about what design is and tries to figure out what we do with it today. I said this book feels like it was written for me, but it's also one of those books I wish I had written. It's a book that I'm surprised hasn't been written before, but I'm so glad that Maggie did. I'm so glad that she did it now because I think she did it better than I would have or any of us would have. She's masterful in surveying a swath of intellectual history around design to tell a compelling narrative about why today, in 2025, we think about design in the way we do. I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. And if you did, and if you like what we do here, you can support our work by joining our Substack. We have a monthly newsletter that's free for everybody, but we also have a paid tier that gets you a bonus interview each month and helps keep all of these episodes free for everybody all the time. I have started to say that I want this show to feel like a great conversation in a coffee shop. And so for the price of a cup of coffee a month, you can help us do this work and put more of these conversations out into the world. Maggie Gram, welcome to the show.
Jarrett, thanks so much for having me. I'm so excited and honored to be here.
I went into your book not knowing exactly what kind of book this was going to be. And I knew I was going to like this book when I got to page 3. And you write on page 3, design was invented in large part through discourse. And as somebody who, basically is talking about design with people all the time, I was immediately taken with this idea. And I want to know what that actually means. What does it mean that design was created through discourse, through conversation, through ideas?
Thanks, Jarrett. I think one of the reasons I wrote this book was to kind of argue that there's a way of thinking about design that is not as some kind of like organic, always existing thing that people have been doing since they started creating tools or whatever it might be, but as kind of a constructed idea that we have created over time, and especially since the Industrial Revolution, and that does work. Um, the word discourse, which we're all familiar with, um, I like to remember means like from the Latin, kind of to run to and fro,
Mm.
uh,
Mm.
as well as kind of, I guess it's related to another Latin word that means argument. And I really love the architecture critic Sarah Williams Goldhagen's uh, description of the word discourse as, or of the idea of discourse as a bunch of people running around having an argument.
Yeah.
Exactly, kind of a series of arguments and debates. And that's how I came to see the idea of design as this kind of like contested, always kind of always being added to and augmented and argued about um, idea
Yeah.
that has held and continues to hold just a great deal of value, but hasn't really always meant the same thing. So that's where I started.
I I, I want to ask you about that, but I want to ask you like a very sort of practical question first, because I think that's the challenge of a book like this is that design is such a broad word that means different things, that has meant different things to different people over time. And I want to know how you put a frame around what you were going to include in this book or not include in this book. How did you start to, I'm not asking you to define design, but how did you start to define it at least internally for yourself to map this history? Because, kind of like you just said, this is not a book about styles. This is not a book about trends. This is not really even a book about figures, although figures from design are in here. It's really about how this idea of design has changed. And so this book is largely 20th century, largely American, largely kind of product design, industrial design, graphic design. It's not architecture. It's not fashion.
Mhm.
Um, it's not, landscape design. How did you kind of define that for yourself to then track these discourses?
So I think there are a couple of kind of legitimate ways of answering that, and a couple of ways of answering that are just uh, to say those are just limitations of the book and not matters of design. So, but the kind of the ways of answering that question as intentional that
Well, I mean, I think it's also fair to say, and sorry to cut you off, I think it's also fair to say, like, hey, you need to have a frame around this, or else this book would last forever. And I guess I'm kind of curious, how did you define that frame, knowing you needed one?
totally. When I was first thinking about writing this book, I thought like, what's this is the most hubristic book I could possibly write. It's so big, and yet I wanted to do it anyway.
Yeah.
I the word. So it's not a history about. It's not a history of the word design.
Mhm.
It is an idea that kind of exists across different languages, and it has a lot of the same characteristics or associations across different languages. But it the kind of emergence of the word design as meaning something recognizable to us as practitioners today is kind of a hint that the idea was emerging. And that happened really around the end of the 19th century. I mean, the word was in use before that, but it was kind of a more direct descendant of again, from the Latin term, and then from, I guess, the Old French,
Right, right.
to draw. Um, and so through the 19th century, design meant the arts that came from drawing, which included sculpture and painting and architecture. Um, but really was thought of as visual art, like art, visual
Mm,
called design. So when you went to design school, you were becoming a painter or an illustrator.
Right.
Uh, and then early in the 20th century, as people trained in the visual arts began to be hired into industry, because the kind of commercial products of industry were becoming commodities and they needed to be differentiated from one another. And it seemed like a good way to differentiate your products with potential consumers. Those people, because they were trained in those arts, were called designers,
Right.
and to be brought into that space. Early on in the 20th century, obviously, that their work came to involve more than just kind of bringing visual or aesthetic appeal to objects. It came to also encompass making things more functional. And
Hmm.
when these different ideas start to come together in this um, post-industrial revolution context, for me, that's the moment that our contemporary kind of conglomeration of ideas that is the
Mm.
design starts to emerge. So it made sense for me that it was a kind of long 20th century story in
Yeah.
that way. I think some of the other kind of aspects of the frame, like that it is mostly American, that it doesn't touch very much on architecture or really at all on fashion design, are just kind of limitations of my own vantage, and my kind of awareness that although I have read all of the William J. Eric Curtis modern architecture, I did not go to architecture school. I don't know enough about fashion design. And it is possible to tell this story in ways um, that focus on speakers and actors and other kind of contributors to the discourse who are more proximate to me. But could have been a very different book, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And there's some overlap here. I do think that the history of the discourse of design, especially the 20th century history of the discourse of design, is fairly just can fairly be described as an American story,
Hmm.
far as the United States was where a lot of power lived in
Yeah.
the 20th century. And the history of discourse is always kind of a history of power because
Yeah.
people with power have the most, are amplified the most when they speak.
Yeah.
Uh, so are able to contribute most lastingly to the discourse. And it was, legitimately the American century in a
Yeah.
way that this century even is not.
Yeah. I have a lot of questions about design's relationship to power for you. Um, you also write early in the book, you say this is also not an argument about what design really is, if it has any such transhistorical essence or what it should be. I
Mhm.
don't care whether design exists in some transhistorical way. I care when and why we started believing that it does. And I think this is where it's starting to get to this question of power. And so what you do with the book is you then go through these different, I'm not sure what to call them, movements, eras, epochs, ideas, um, about how design has done that: beauty, function, problem solving, human centeredness, experience, and thinking. And as I was reading the book, I was thinking about each of these movements. And I hope this does not sound like a critique of your book or a critique of the title. I don't mean it that. But as I was reading, it was like, oh, maybe this is less about invention and this is actually about legitimization.
Mm.
That the figures that you are talking to in each of these moments, the people who wanted design to be about beauty, the people who wanted design to be about function or problem solving, what this was a almost like a self-actualizing exercise. This is what I say, that what I'm doing is valuable, or a way to put a frame around it, a way to legitimize it in some sort of, capitalist relationship to power way. Does that sound right to you, or do you agree with that reading of your book?
It certainly sounds right, but I think a way of saying that is these are the moments in which somebody's way of thinking about what they do kind of wins in the discourse.
Yeah, yeah,
So, at the beginning of the century, design was most often associated with beauty or aesthetics. And then the people who wanted it to be associated with function kind of won out in the Depression era because of, various kind of economic forces. And then with the end of World
yeah,
War II, beginning of the Cold War, the kind of cold warriors who wanted it to be about problem solving so that we could, defeat our global, Americans could defeat their kind of global enemies, imagined or real, won out in part because they had the backing of all the Rands of the world and the kind of
Right.
various other think tanks. By the second half of the 20th century, the kind of there was a moment when thinking of design as human centered was advantageous for corporations as well as other actors, and so that aspect of the discourse and those people who, the Victor Papaneks and others who
Hmm.
wanted to serve themselves as their work as human centered began to want out. And then there was a kind of experience economy moment where those people's way of thinking about it was appealing and kind of particularly worked for
Yeah.
global capitalism. And then there was a moment when design as a way of thinking was appealing to markets, and so it kind of won out. But yeah, I think thinking of it um, as a story of not just people running around, but sort of vying for attention and legitimacy and
Yeah.
well, is a good way of thinking about it.
Yeah. And what's also interesting to me, and I think I'm kind of thinking about this out loud as you were answering, as I was kind of hearing your answer. There's certainly some waxing and waning about the priorities of design, and what is how design is valued or how design is judged or how design is articulated. And you go from beauty to function just as a very simple idea is a move from how something looks to design is also how it works.
Mm-hmm.
um, but and then you go to that to then it's not just how it works but how it is solving a particular problem, how it is solving a particular problem for a person, how that person is having experience that maybe the where the gaze is focused changes. But my kind of interesting reading of this is that none of these are actually ever fully replacing the era that came before or the idea that came before. Each one of these is an expansion of what design can be. And with that expansion, that is also moving the designer deeper into the process. So if you start at beauty, it is something purely aesthetic. And by the time you get to thinking, design is now rooted through all of them. And so these movements are also a consolidation of power for the designer. It is an expanding of the purview of the designer.
Absolutely. I mean, and that helps me understand why we have invested so much cultural capital and actual capital in the idea of design now, is that it is in fact um, where we've put a lot of our ideas about what's good in the making.
Right.
And it's kind of at this point a grab bag. That so the kind of accumulativeness of the idea of design and of this story made it much easier to write the last chapter than the first
Right.
chapter. Because by the time you get to design as a way of thinking, you can kind of recognize the way that IDEO and the other um, kind of advocates for the idea of design thinking were drawing from what had worked best in all of the practices and the for them and just kind of packaging it up together as something new.
Oh yeah, that's a really interesting way. So design thinking in lowercase d, lowercase t, let's say, is actually a repackaging of everything that has come before.
Oh,
And perhaps that is why it has been so kind of astronomically successful, is because it's actually just it's taking all of these movements and saying all of this actually falls under one umbrella.
right. I found myself, I started out quite critical of the idea of design thinking and wrote a kind of a snarky essay about it that
Hmm.
got the book started. And by the time I finished the book, I thought, there's a reason that this works for a lot of people and that it works in the market, and often it comes up with great ideas. And that reason is like all of the designers who came before it um, brought together a lot of wonderful ways of thinking
Mm.
about making things and solving problems, et cetera, et cetera. And this is a kind of grouping of all of those things. I think um, the branding of it and the kind of um, massive overinvestment in it in some particular contexts that don't have a lot of money to begin with can make it feel a little bit nerve wracking to me. But yeah, there are reasons that there are reasons that it works so well in certain places and contexts.
The other thing this is making me think of is that this is also a history of moving from something. I'm going to give a bunch of words that are very reductive, but just for the sake of argument, moving from something artistic, conceptual, intuitive to something structured and logical and engineering based esque. And I'm wondering if you could talk about that tension a little bit, or that evolution of I think just to lay my cards on the table, actually, in doing that helps consolidate power. That helps design, get that seat at the table, get that, kind of show how it is solving these bigger problems. Um, but it also kind of weirdly like narrows what design can do, because now it's solving a certain set of problems, or you're going through a certain type of process, or it is doing a certain type of thing. Walk me through how you're thinking about that evolution of the design process itself, maybe.
Yeah, thanks for that good question and articulation. I One of the reasons I started thinking about the writing the book to begin with was that I came to design late myself, as I had been to graduate school in the humanities and kind of tried to teach English in universities for a couple of years and realized that that was not a place where there a lot of jobs were opening up, and moved into through a kind of series of research efforts myself, moved
Mm-hmm.
into design research because I had some kind of ethnography background, and then from there into design just by kind of shadowing other people and being interested in what they were doing and making that I was
Yeah.
producing. And there was a digital product design company. I was working in digital product design or UX, and I loved where I had landed. And I also loved the idea of being a designer. I felt myself kind of um, embarrassingly attracted to the term, and it felt very um, captivating to me. And I, but I also felt like it was actually for somebody else and not something that I legitimately had claim to. And I think it was because I did have a deep analytical sense and a kind of confidence in my own analytical abilities, but not any kind of artistic training or background. And so I became kind of fascinated with the ways that these very different ideas kind of lived together in one concept for us today. Uh,
Yeah.
in the end, I felt that one of my kind of favorite parts of writing this book was the opportunity to point out the ways that, in fact, it's not at all about today, all about analytical problem solving, whatever it might be. There's just a great deal of irrationality and emotion and play and art that is still like deeply inherent in our ideas about design and what good design can be. And I think a lot about Charles and Ray
Yep.
Eames's Solar Do Nothing machine, which they made in
Yeah.
1957. It's just a really beautiful, colorful machine made of gears and moving elements and objects. And they turn and they move and they do nothing.
Yeah.
They accomplish nothing. They solve no problem. They are purely for the purpose of play. And I think they were, that Solo Do Nothing machine was kind of a joke on the part of the Eameses, because it looks so industrial. It looks so much like
Right.
it is going to solve a problem. But it's also serious. It's also saying that this this element of play is um, like it can't be separated from the project of design, and design would not be itself without it. So
I love that you brought up the Eameses, because I was thinking about them also with that question in mind. I think your articulation there reveals a tension or a conflict that I've always felt in their work, is in the way they talk about design as being something very rational and problem solving, and yet the actual work and process doesn't actually feel like that. And I think for me, that's one of the central tensions of this book that I'm really curious about how you think about it, is that as we've been talking about now for what, a half hour, Design is this really slippery, open term that can handle a bunch of different things. And yet, the designers who you profile in this book, who are redefining it or giving it new language, don't actually think about it that way. They actually tend to want to put borders around it. They
Mhm.
want to say, design is this thing. You can even look at that with the Eames. Design is problem solving.
You're constantly saying that.
And that, on one hand, is great for this idea of legitimizing design. You give it a border, you give it a definition. But as soon as you define what design is, you're also defining what design is not. And that is keeping a bunch of other things out. And I'm wondering, like, how do you think about that? This idea that in this act of consolidating power, of legitimizing design, all of these things we're talking about, how did that actually force out other things that could be a part of this story, that could be a part of what we think of as design, that were, and I'm not saying that you didn't consider, but that were not considered in each of these eras because they didn't conform to the winning definition, to use your phrase.
Yeah, that's such a good question. I mean, you and I were just talking before we started recording about the kind of recent history, or really
Yeah.
long history of the idea of graphic design and what is
Right.
kind of pushed out of that bucket and the kind of consequences of that. So I want to hear your answer to this question too.
No, this is my show.
One thing I'll say is I so this is not actually a direct answer to your question about kind of what's lost. But I will say that I think sometimes the exclusion is quite intentional. And the reason, like, here's an example of a time that that's the case, and we could use it to think about why. Um, I think often design thinking is brought into organizations as specifically as a foil to the way that those organizations think or
Mm,
or operate otherwise. So, get up from your cubicle, leave behind your computer, come to this open space with other people across functions and play with these post-it
right. I
notes.
was gonna say there's post-it notes involved. Yeah.
Move
Sharpies.
move from should to might.
Right.
Some of those words. I think that often design is posed as this kind of alternative to other ways of getting things done, and,
Mm,
and that there, in many contexts, is something very appealing about that. And it's part of the reason that we kind of fetishize the idea of design is that it's not all these other things. So, um, and it doesn't entirely answer the question, but I think it's interesting.
no, I mean, no, it kind of does, because I guess maybe like the question behind the question is, if design can be all of these different things, and if it can be all of these, if it potentially can be these things that have previously been left out. And I'm thinking about things like craft, like what is craft's relationship to design, and
Mhm.
especially like in opposition to something like problem solving or human centeredness. um what is the usefulness of that word design anymore? And I realize that's a huge question. Like, has that word actually outgrown itself? um there is value in the legacy of it, but is there also value in just kind of like opening it up and like maybe the question that I'm really asking as I'm thinking out loud is like, what is actually the thing that ties all these things together anymore, other than the winning argument? Like
Other that they've won, that they've
right,
been
right.
victorious. I, for me, the thing that ties them all together is that they are really inherently hopeful. They're
Mm,
inherently utopian. They're this like amalgam of idealistic ideas, idealistic visions about how people might live, in the context of capitalism and the kind of destabilization that markets introduce into life. Like all these ideas are about kind of using creative forces to bring some kind of order, uh, kind of using them as a tool to fix the broken aspects of our sort of market society from within. Um, they're dreamy, they're fantastical, they're utopic, they are excited about the future, they're about what could be or might be, and they are, yeah, they're hopeful. Um, and I think that for me, that is what keeps me compelled by them, is that it's easy to be cynical about all these kind of the ideas that won at any particular moment, and this kind of now like very up, highly valued concept that amalgamates all of them. But um, the writer, design writer, critic, and also public servant Nikhil Saval
Hmm.
wrote something like, at its heart, design is the most hopeful medium.
Yeah.
Feels true to me.
Well, I want to talk about that actually, because I feel like I agree with that in theory, but I also look around and don't always feel that. And I feel like this is a way to talk about the book's sort of parallel political project. Um, because, and maybe this says more about me than you, honestly, I felt a hint of skepticism in reading the book about the hopeful ideals of design. Walk me through how you kind of thought about that, this idea of design being something inherently hopeful, design being about imagining the future, imagining what could be, imagining realizing that things are not the way they should be and that they could be better or different.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
then a history of all the places that, but then at the same time, you're writing a book, there's a history of all the places that fell short in many ways too.
Yeah, it's when I hear this question, I think a little bit about my own trajectory in writing the book, because I did again start out feeling somewhat cynical and become more cynical as I kind of got deeper into the way that the sausage was made, and
Right.
all the places that, defining or delimiting design as it was defined or delimited in a particular moment was, beneficial to the Rand Corporation idea or whatever it might be. But, in the end, I felt that uh, we need that hope so badly. We need a kind of framework for thinking about how to chip away at wicked problems. We need kind of broadly participatory methods for doing that, and we need the idea to be capacious enough that it brings people in and makes them feel um, welcome. And insofar as design can be that idea, and insofar as it can kind of contribute to the project of building kind of um, communal social power, like it should, and I'm glad it exists.
Early in the book, you write something. I love this line in the book. You write, design, in short, made capitalism feel, both to its participants and to its subjects, less brutal and inhumane, less destructive. It seemed to give them a way to reclaim the things they'd made and to re-embed them in a human order. And I think one of the critiques that I hear about design a lot is that it is it is a tool for capitalism. You quote a German philosopher, Wolfgang Fritz Haug, who described designers as handmaidens of capitalism.
It's unsubtle.
Yeah, yeah, I love that line too. I'm gonna like use that with my students. Um, but I think what's interesting is design makes capitalism feel less brutal by the design of design itself. Designers are the handmaidens of capitalism by this discourse that we've been talking about. And it strikes me that capitalism needs design, but design doesn't necessarily need capitalism. Maybe this is a way to go back to like what gets left out of the story. I'm curious about like how your book is in many ways looking at how designers are the handmaidens of capitalism, how design has been in service of that. But you end the book saying like it doesn't have to be, or at least that was my reading of it, is that like design can also be involved in these other questions. And I'm wondering if the tools that design has used in service of capitalism, beauty, function, problem solving, human centeredness, can those also be the tools that help us think outside of capitalism or beyond it or, past it or outside of, whatever? Like, is it that the way design has been structured, is that because it's under capitalism it is doing that? Or can these same tools be used and these same ideas about design be used to resist and live in opposition of?
I think the fact that design is what it is the product of the 20th century, is the product of history. I mean, it came to be because it helped us imagine reversing some of the damage wrought by the Industrial Revolution. It helped us convince ourselves that capitalism fundamentally served human interests. And if you look at the emergence of human-centered design in the 70s and 80s, it comes straight out of contexts in which people are really wanting to convince themselves that Western society in particular can do good, even though it's also doing the Vietnam War. Um, but history is not the future. I mean, history does not, it offers us hints about where things may be going,
Right.
but it's not determined, it doesn't determine where we go. And these ideas, I don't think these ideas are inextricable from their kind of market capitalism context of origin. I think the making things and listening to people who might use them as you make them in order to try to make them better or as best as they can be, and trying to solve some of the problems that those people experience in everyday life and trying to make those things beautiful are all things that can be done and often have been done in
Yeah.
contexts that are not organized by market capitalism.
Right.
There are
Right.
lots of ways to organize society,
Right.
and I mean, I don't know about ways to organize society at scale. That kind of
Yeah.
on my pay grade, but you can observe historically that people have made things in other contexts and have lived in other ways, and I don't think these ideas are inextricable from their context of origin. I think it's good to notice where they came from and what context so that you can notice the kind of assumptions inherent in them, but they can go other places and they should.
Yeah, I always joke that what we often call human-centered design today is really just like a corporation-centered design. It's things that are designed to just kind of feed the parent company.
Oh,
But
true,
like
true, but
here, but hearing your answer, it's like, but that doesn't mean that there's not real human-centered design. Human-centered design in that particular context maybe has gotten twisted to serve it, but like there actually still is something about designing for a person that lives outside of these. And so I think you're right. There's a framing and a context that can shift these, but that doesn't mean that is one or the other. Related to that, you mentioned earlier that you kind of came into design through a kind of side door. You were kind of drawn to these ideas. You work in design now. You were working in design while you were writing this book. How did actually kind of being in a design context, working as a designer in the 21st century, how did that color or shape how you approached this book?
I mentioned that I started out in this field not as a designer but as a design researcher, and I loved that work. I loved asking people good questions and listening to them describe what their experiences were like. I was working with mostly people who are going through some form of medical treatment because I was
Mm,
working with kind of health related product design. And it felt so worthwhile and just kind of a meaningful way to spend one's time to listen to people talk about what it was like, for instance, to go through chemotherapy and be susceptible to chemo driven infection,
mm,
or to kind of be in a regular cadence of going to dialysis, and what the kind of reality of that is like for the individual people with whom I was talking. And I think part of the reason it felt worthwhile was that people don't get asked those questions
yeah.
and listened to deeply that often. But it also felt worthwhile to potentially be bringing those experiences into the project of making something that tried to address some of those problems. And I think I realized over time that I had probably over indexed on the degree to which um, the human centeredness of design was real, and like those projects are always sponsored by somebody. In this case, they were often sponsored by pharmaceutical companies.
Right, right, right.
Uh, but I but I do think I've tried to bring both that skepticism that came later about
Yeah.
what design does and can do, and that sense of um, kind of uncynical hope about some of its kind of potentials or capacities to my work to this day. I mean, I now work in a kind of a similar, in some ways, context in that I work on security and privacy for Google Cloud customers. So
Mhm.
I lead a team that makes tools that help Google Cloud customers keep their data and their applications secure and private. And there are aspects of it that I believe deeply in. I was saying to a bunch of Pratt students who I was talking to the other day that I started to think of compliance as kind of like the sexiest thing. In that, like, compliance is about making something um, accord with the collective intent of a society.
Hmm.
Like,
Yeah,
regulation is collective intent, and compliance is bringing a made object or experience or system into line with that
yeah,
intent.
yeah.
I've come to believe deeply in that. On the other hand, there are many Google Cloud customers, including nation states, that um, to say that I disagree deeply with the directions that they're taking would be just a tremendous understatement. I don't
Yeah.
know. We have to hold these things in tension. Yeah.
Let me ask you the opposite of that question. Has writing, and maybe you were starting to answer it actually in that answer, but has writing this book changed how you do your job or how you think about your job or how you think about your role at Google now?
I think it's made me more relaxed and less defensive about what I do.
Oh, what do you mean by that?
I think it's helped me see that what we do as designers, it's real and it's important and it contributes, but it's not sacred. It's not um, something that's existed since the beginning of society. It's of its moment, and it can be what we make of it. I often am leading teams of people who know just profoundly more about what they're doing than I do, whether it's kind of technical design
Yeah.
or graphic design or whatever it might be. Um, and that feels okay to me in that it is just an enormous tent that was only made like essentially a couple of weeks ago. this
Right.
this giant tent that is
Yeah.
designed today. And so it feels both more comfortable and just more creative to be part of it, in that it kind of can be what we need it to be in a particular place and time.
That's a really nice way to start to bring this conversation full circle and bring it to a close because I know that you are a historian. This is a book of history, but as we discussed, you're also a practicing designer today in 2025. We started this conversation talking about discourse and how discourse has really what shaped design and what made design what we know it today. As you look up from your desk today, what discourses do you see happening around design? How do you see this moment and these conversations as
Mm-hmm.
shaping how we think about what design is or how we believe in design, to use your word again, um, today in 2025? How do these, what's happened since the
Yeah.
20th century, I guess is the question.
I think we have not converged on a useful new way of thinking about what design is in the context of generative AI. But I do have a kind of more prescriptive than descriptive thought about that, which is that, if over the course of the 20th century we came to think of design as all these other things, function, problem solving, et cetera, we need now to think of it explicitly as intent. Um,
Mm,
I think we don't know. We know that generative AI is powerful. We don't know exactly how it will play out. We know that an AI agent inherits all the permissions its users have,
yeah.
and
Yeah.
none of that user specific and contextually informed human judgment. They are machines and they make decisions and learn a lot like people and they act on behalf of people with all of their authority, but have kind of none of the inherent guardrails that
Yeah.
most kind of socialized people have. And so it is our responsibility as designers, as people who have um, these various kind of forms of training and capability and positionality,
Hmm.
bring to those kind of new machines some of the actual specific embodied human intent that we have as people and that LLMs can't have.
Right.
That's why I've been thinking about compliance, is that I think um, regulatory intent is such a powerful instantiation of a society's specific human embodied
Yeah.
intent
Yeah.
set of intents. And I think as designers, we have a responsibility for putting those guardrails in place, for working close to generative AI, for kind of making decisions to override the AI's decisions in a particular moment, to do user testing and measurement
Yeah.
and monitoring and intervention and iteration and adjustment, and kind of get involved in the training of the model and its grounding and its implementation and embedding, response quality standards in the system process. But yeah, intent is where I hope we'll go. But I think we're pretty early in the figuring it out.
I want to end this conversation by going to the end of your book. In the books afterward, you have a sentence that, in some ways, I found to be the most provocative in the entire book. The first line of the afterword is, "We love design most when we're afraid."
Mm-hmm.
First, what does that mean?
Insofar as design is a response to these kind of social and historical and material conditions at various points in the 20th century that have been challenging. Um, we need it most in those moments of challenge. So
Hmm.
again, the Industrial Revolution had these kind of painful costs and disrupted agrarian societies, and people kind of responded by embracing industrialists' idea of design as beautification
Mm,
of industrial objects. And we had this kind of fantasy that it might help. And I think we, as the people, if you look back at the writings of, you know, uh, Eva Zeisel, Walter Teague,
yeah.
some of these people that I read about earlier in the book, um, they have these beautiful ideas about the kind of connections that design can make between kind of makers and their end users, even as in reality those connections were getting kind of more and more
Yeah.
tenuous. And then I think it happened again, like in the throes of the Great Depression. People's kind of um, terror about the idea of too much government intervention in the context of the New Deal helped kind of transform design from an idea about aesthetics to one about function. And the kind of same thing happened during the Cold War, where the kind of most powerful, or one of the most powerful countries in the world, embraced the idea of design as problem solving because they kind of loved the
Hmm.
possibility that they could make it kind of rational and objective and repeatable and inherently good and use it
Yeah.
to defeat their enemies. So it is a pattern that in these kind of moments of social and political crisis, we turn to this kind of um, set of very hopeful um, ideas about our own capabilities, and embrace them. And maybe that's what I'm doing now. I mean, I certainly, in hoping for design as intent, I'm kind of grasping at the possibility of kind of good healing human agency.
Yeah. Yeah,
And
no, that's exactly why I asked you that, because I think as we've kind of talked around in this conversation, I think there's a lot of parallels in design history to this current moment that we're living in. I think there's a lot to be afraid of today. You know, you were already talking about AI and LLMs and agents, and I think this the wars around the world, the whatever kind of political crisis is in this country. There's a lot to be afraid of, and I think what's interesting, and I hope this question doesn't sound negative. I'm trying not to end on a negative note, but I
you know,
think
the New Yorker called my book bleak. It's that line of the review was something like, "Her vision is bleak." And I thought, you know what? I'll take it. The times are bleak. My vision
yeah,
is bleak.
the times are bleak, and I think there's a growing awareness, at least among the conversations that I'm having with designers, is that yes, design is hopeful, design is what we turn to, but design has also gotten us into some of these problems. You know, we are in a moment where Elon Musk is running Doge and is firing, the government designers, where, co-founder of Airbnb is tasked to redesign government services, which I think is doing what you're saying, actually, insofar as it's using design as a smokescreen to make us feel better or to make some people feel better. But there's also this sense that's like, what if we're actually scared of design too? Like, what if this is actually part of the problem? And I'm wondering how you think about how we move through that. How do we find new conversations to talk about design? How do we move away from design as a handmaiden of capitalism, design as a consolidation of power, to be something that we can turn to when we are afraid?
I think maybe the answer has something to do with scale, that we have to start to see design as the relatively small thing that it is in the larger
Yeah.
context. It's really,
Yeah. Yeah.
it it's easy for me to get wound up about the kind of um, um, potentially damaging and illusory like nature of what I'm doing, but the problems are so much bigger. the um, the kind of lack of global alignment about what a good society looks like, and the kind of response to that by people's kind of, what am I trying to say, in the context of kind of damaging populism, and in the context of several years of genocide that's been very visible to those of us, um,
Mm-hmm.
social media, and
Mm-hmm.
to which the response has been almost nothing. I I think it's easy also to recognize that just design is maybe of limited importance. I, that's not a good answer to the question. I don't know.
No, I actually think that is a good answer. I mean, I think if there's a message to the book, and you have this line in the book where you say, there are a lot of good ideas and useful practices wrapped up in the contemporary concept of design, and expanding design scope means those ideas can have greater reach. The problem is that ideas alone, without institutional commitment to and resources for implementation, are just, well, ideas. I think that's what you're saying is like design only has relevance. It only has power. It can only do the things that it claims it wants to do if it is plugged into the right institutions with the right people,
Mhm.
recognizing that it is a piece of a larger project to envision the world that we want to see. Design alone cannot save the world. That's what, like, when I was in design school, that was the thing. It was like, oh, design can save the world. Like, design can do anything. It's like, no, 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 no. Design in collaboration with all these other people is the way that happens. Maybe.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, It's a couple days. We're recording a couple days before an election day, and I'm in New York City, and I'm watching the Mamdani campaign kind of sprint to the finish and a marathon of campaigning. And I think like I feel real hope about that campaign. Knock on wood. But when I think like what is working so far, who knows what will happen, but what's working, I think so much work, so much knocking on doors and talking to people and making little videos that are listening to the people that are interviewed in the videos, and meeting every single politician in New York City who is opposed the Zohran Mamdani campaign. It's just an incredible amount of labor that has gone into that campaign. And I think, we can call that kind of work design. We can say like there has been, the implementation of intent, and they've made things better, it's whatever. Or we can not. But ultimately, like, what matters is that work is kind of building consensus about what the good is and building political power around that consensus and making sure that people are included in it regardless of how power they have to begin with. And I think we should call that design when it's so, and we should leave it behind when it's not. I guess what I really came away from writing the book with was it can be what we want it to be.
If that's not a hopeful way to end this conversation, I don't know what is. Forget this bleak stuff. I love that. Maggie, thank you so much. This was such a wonderful conversation.
Jarrett, thanks so much for the honor of being on this show.
And that was my conversation with Maggie Gram. Her new book is called The Invention of Design, A 20th Century History. Our theme music is by Jeremiah Chu. The show is funded thanks to the generosity of listeners like you. If you like what we're doing, I hope you consider supporting us and get some bonus content each month. You can follow us across social media at Surface Podcast. You can listen to all of our previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts and at our website, scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.